I tried to summon a pepperoni pizza at 3 a.m., and instead, I accidentally summoned a 7-foot-tall demon lord who wants to be my zaddy. Yeah, you heard that right. They say the hour between 3 and 4 in the morning is when the veil between worlds is the thinnest. Most people are tucked away in their beds, dreaming of normal things, but I was wide awake, mapping the jagged cracks in my ceiling. My name is Rin, and I was currently experiencing a level of hunger that felt less like a craving and more like a physical assault. My stomach wasn't just growling. It felt like it was trying to digest itself. A hollow, acidic ache that radiated from my spine to my ribs. Every time I shifted on my thin, lumpy mattress, I could feel the emptiness inside me, a cavernous space that my $2.47 could never hope to fill. I had spent the last 20 minutes debating whether that pocket change was enough for a loaf of bread at the 24-hour bodega down the street, but the thought of the cold walk and the humiliation of counting out pennies held me back. Instead, I lay there, listening to the rhythmic, mocking drip of my leaky kitchen faucet. Every drop felt like a second of my life ticking away in a studio apartment that smelled like damp laundry, old radiator steam, and forgotten dreams. I was 23, and I was failing at the basic art of existing. I finally sat up, my head swimming with a dizzying rush of vertigo. I needed a distraction, anything to stop my mind from looping back to an image of a pepperoni pizza. Thick, bubbling mozzarella, spicy meat, and a crust so buttery it would melt on my tongue. The phantom smell of oregano and grease was so strong it was almost cruel. I got out of bed, my feet hitting the cold, warped linoleum floor, and started rummaging through a cardboard box in the corner. I'd picked up a few things at a yard sale last weekend. The woman running it had looked like she hadn't slept since the Nixon administration, her eyes cloudy and her hands trembling as she practically shoved a stack of old leather-bound books into my hands for $5. I'd bought them mostly because the covers looked cool, and I needed something to fill the empty shelf space I'd never been able to afford actual books for. I remember her whispering something about them being hungry, but I'd assumed she was just another local eccentric. I pulled out the heaviest one. It was bound in a dark, pebbled leather that felt strangely cold, almost like touching a lizard's skin. The title was embossed in faded gold, Feasts for the Soul. In my delirious, lightheaded state, I genuinely thought it was a vintage cookbook. I figured maybe there'd be a recipe for a simple dough I could make with a half cup of expired flour sitting in my pantry. Maybe I could conjure a miracle out of dust. I dragged the book to my small kitchen table and flipped it open. The pages didn't feel like paper. They were thick and yellowed, like parchment made of something much sturdier than wood pulp. There were no pictures of casseroles or tips on roasting a turkey. Instead, the pages were covered in intricate hand-drawn diagrams, circles within circles, filled with symbols that looked like a cross between sacred geometry and a fever dream. The ink seemed to shimmer, even in the dim light of my single overhead bulb. My eyes landed on a heading written in a flowing, aggressive script. Carnis delici, delicious meat. That's what my brain translated it to. I don't know why I thought I could read Latin or whatever ancient language this was, but the words felt heavy in my mind, almost as if they were whispering themselves to my blood. I was so hungry I was vibrating, and some primitive part of me decided that if I couldn't buy food, maybe I could wish it into existence. It was a joke, really. A way to pass the time until the sun came up and I could face the reality of my empty cupboards. I gathered the only candles I had, 3 vanilla-scented pillars from the dollar store. I set them in a triangle on the floor, right in front of the fridge, and placed the book in the center. I felt like a total idiot. There I was, standing in my oversized bunny pajamas, the ones with the floppy ears on the hood, trying to perform a ritual for a snack. It was the peak of my desperation. I struck a match and lit the candles. The scent of fake vanilla filled the air, clashing with the metallic smell of the old pipes. I looked down at the book and began to read the Latin aloud. I tried to give it some weight, some dramatic flair. I wanted to feel like I was doing something important, even if it was just a hallucination born of starvation. I reached the phrase Carnis Delicie, and I tried to roll the R the way I'd heard in old movies. I rolled it too hard. I hit the conjugation with an emphasis that felt like a physical click in the air. I didn't realize it at the time, but I hadn't asked for a meal. I had issued a summons. I hadn't asked for delicious meat. I had called for the Prince of Carnal Delight. The moment the last syllable left my lips, The room went silent. Not a normal silence, but a vacuum. The dripping faucet stopped. The hum of the refrigerator died. Even the distant, muffled sound of city traffic vanished as if the world outside had been erased. The air became heavy and thick, smelling suddenly of ozone and ancient, smoldering wood smoke. The flames of my vanilla candles didn't flicker. They turned a deep, bruised purple, stretching upward like tiny, hungry fingers. And then, the floor began to tear. I watched, frozen in place, as a jagged crack ripped through my linoleum. It led into a void of swirling, angry red smoke that bled light like a fresh wound. The sound was deafening. A deep, tectonic grinding of stone against stone that seemed to shake the very foundations of the apartment building. Then, a hand emerged. It was massive, the skin a dark, obsidian black, etched with glowing veins of orange that looked like cooling lava. Long, elegant fingers tipped with obsidian claws gripped the edge of the crack, shattering the wood and tile like it was dry glass. He rose out of the floor like a nightmare being born from the earth. He was 7 feet tall, at least. 2 magnificent curved horns of black glass swept back from his forehead, and a long, barbed tail lashed behind him, knocking my magnetic spice rack off the fridge with a violent clatter. He looked like power incarnate, his chest broad and glowing with that same internal fire. His eyes were the worst part, and the best. They were pits of white-hot hellfire, burning with an intelligence that was ancient, terrifying, and strangely focused. The sheer heat coming off him was like standing in front of an open furnace. He loomed over me, blotting out the light of my tiny kitchen, his presence so immense it felt like the walls were shrinking to accommodate him. As his eyes scanned my tiny apartment, they lingered on my pile of unpaid bills with a strange, calculating interest, as if he were analyzing the very systems of human power and debt before he even looked at me. He let out a growl that vibrated through my very bones, shaking the cereal boxes on top of the fridge. He looked around the room with a sneer of pure, unadulterated coldness. "Who dares?" he roared. "Who calls Malphas the devourer from the 7th circle?" I stood there, clutching a plastic spatula in my hand as if it were a sword, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. I looked up at him, my neck straining to see his face. I was so terrified I couldn't even scream. All I could think about was how much I'd screwed up. I squeaked out the only thing my brain could formulate. I ordered a pepperoni with extra cheese?" The demon froze. The terrifying, world-ending aura around him seemed to stutter. He looked down at me, his burning eyes traveling from my messy hair to the floppy bunny ears on my hood, down to my bare feet. He looked at the spatula, then at the book on the floor. With a movement so fast I didn't even see it, he snatched the book from the ground. He flipped through the pages with a snarl, his claws leaving deep gouges in the parchment. "You incompetent little mortal," he hissed, his voice like velvet over gravel. "You emphasized the wrong syllable. You used the imperative masculine form. You didn't ask for pizza, you asked for a master." He stepped closer, and I backed up until the handle of the refrigerator was poking into my spine. He was so close I could smell him. He didn't smell like rot or sulfur. He smelled like leather, dark chocolate, and a summer storm. The heat radiating from his skin made my pajamas feel like they were about to catch fire. "Please don't eat me," I begged, my voice trembling. "I'm mostly carbs and anxiety. I won't taste good. I promise. I'm basically junk food." He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could see the cracks in his skin, the way the light glowed deep inside his chest. He took a long, deep inhale, his chest expanding until he took up my entire field of vision. He wasn't just smelling me. He was tasting the air around me, deciphering my fear. "Eat you?" he sneered. "Why would I eat a skeleton? I can hear your heart fluttering like a dying bird. And your stomach, it's louder than your prayers." He reached past me. His arm was as thick as my torso and ripped the fridge door open with a screech of metal. He stared at the empty shelves, his gaze falling on the single, shriveled brown lemon sitting in the crisper. He picked it up with 2 fingers, looking at it with an expression of pure insult. "Is this it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "This is your bounty? You summoned a high prince of the pit because you are starving?" Groceries are expensive, I yelled, the fear finally giving way to a spark of desperate frustration. I haven't had a real meal in 3 days. I thought it was a cookbook. I just wanted something to eat. He looked at the lemon, then back at me. His expression shifted. The raw, murderous rage softened into something else. Something intense and possessive. He let out a long, smoky sigh, a cloud of gray vapor curling around my head. Pathetic, he muttered. Humans are so fragile. You have the power to tear the veil between worlds, and you use it to beg for scraps. He snapped his fingers. The sound was like a whip cracking in the small room. Instantly, the smell of fake vanilla was gone, replaced by a scent so divine I felt my knees actually buckle. My stained Formica counter was suddenly overflowing. There was a roast chicken, its skin glistening with herbs and butter. A loaf of sourdough bread, still steaming, the crust perfectly golden. A platter of cheeses, fruits, and wine. And in the center, a pizza that looked like it had been crafted by a god. Buffalo mozzarella, hand-torn basil, and pepperoni that glowed with a rich, spicy oil. I started to slump toward the floor, my body finally giving out from the sudden sensory overload, but Malphas caught me. His hands were huge and warm, wrapping around my waist with a firmness that felt both terrifying and incredibly grounding. He lifted me like I was made of feathers and sat me down on the counter right in front of the food. "Eat," he commanded. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed a slice of the pizza, the heat burning my fingertips, and I practically shoved it into my mouth. I started to cry. It wasn't just that I was hungry. It was the sheer, overwhelming relief of it. The way the cheese melted and the sauce hit my tongue. It felt like coming back to life. As I ate, Malphas didn't disappear. He didn't go back into the crack in the floor. He pulled out my tiny, creaky wooden kitchen chair and sat down. He looked like a titan trying to fit into a dollhouse. He watched me eat, tracking every movement of my throat when I swallowed, his glowing eyes darkening with a strange, predatory satisfaction. He seemed fascinated by the simple act of a human being nourished. "Why are you still here?" I asked through a mouthful of bread. "Don't you have, I don't know, souls to harvest?" "You summoned me, Rin," he said. The way he said my name sent a jolt of electricity down my spine. I hadn't told him my name, but I suppose when you call something from the void, you give it more than just your attention. You give it your identity. The contract is binding. You asked for the Prince of Carnal Delight. You asked for the one who provides for the flesh. Do you think a single meal satisfies that debt? I froze, a piece of chicken halfway to my mouth. "How long is the contract?" "Until I am bored," he whispered, leaning forward until the shadows of his horns stretched across the entire ceiling. "You are weak, unprotected. If I leave you now, you will likely wither away before the sun rises. If I am to haunt this realm, I require a vessel that isn't about to break." The way he said it wasn't a threat. He looked at me the way someone looks at a stray animal they've decided to keep. He didn't want to destroy me. He wanted to sustain me, to see what I would become under his shadow. "I can't pay you," I said softly. "I do not want your paper currency, little human," he said, reaching out to brush a stray crumb from my lip. His claw was sharp, but his touch was incredibly light, almost tender. "I want to see you thrive. I want to see what happens when a creature as fragile as you is given everything it desires." It has been a week since that night. He hasn't left. My life has become a fever dream of luxury and terror. Malphas doesn't fit in my apartment, yet he fills every corner of it. He stays with me, a silent, glowing sentinel who fixed the leaky faucet with a single glare. He spends hours staring at the city through my window, his tail twitching as he studies the way humans navigate their tiny, bureaucratic lives. When my Wi-Fi cut out because I couldn't pay the bill, he growled at the router and pointed a finger. Now I have internet speeds that probably bypass every satellite in orbit. I asked Malphas yesterday when he was going back to the 7th Circle. He was sitting on the floor, the only place he really fits, sharpening a dagger made of bone. He just smirked at me, showing those sharp white teeth. "You summoned carnal delight, Rin," he whispered. "I haven't even given you the dessert yet." Every time he looks at me, I feel that same heat from the first night. He watches me with a possessive, heavy gaze that makes my skin tingle. I should be trying to find a way to banish him. I should be calling a priest or looking for another book to reverse the spell. A part of me wonders if I'm trading my soul for a full stomach and silk sheets, if I'm just a pet to a bored deity. But this morning, I woke up and he was standing by the window, the morning light catching the orange glow of his skin. He turned to me and held out a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what the day would bring. I wasn't wondering where my next meal would come from, or how I would survive the winter. I summoned a demon for a pepperoni pizza. But looking at him now as he watches me with those burning, beautiful eyes, I realized I got something much more dangerous and much more intoxicating. I think I'm keeping him. I think I've spent my whole life being hungry, and for the first time, I've found someone who wants to make sure I'm full, even if he is a prince of hell, even if he's currently using my kitchen table to plan the takeover of a small corporate bank, sketching out digital vulnerabilities with a clawed finger. He's mine. And I'm his. And honestly, I've never felt better. I sat on the edge of my new magically enlarged bed and watched him move through the small space. He was too big for the world, yet he seemed to revolve entirely around me. I reached out and touched his arm. The skin was rough and hot, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, his tail curling contentedly around my ankle. "Rin," he rumbled, his voice vibrating through my hand. "Are you satisfied?" "Not yet," I whispered. He smiled, and for the first time, the fire in his eyes didn't look like destruction. It looked like an invitation. My physical hunger was gone, but a new kind of craving was starting to take its place. A craving for the heat, for the power, and for the demon who decided that I was worth more than a single pepperoni pizza. The floor is still cracked in the kitchen. The vanilla candles are still there, melted into purple puddles on the linoleum. But my life is no longer empty. It's full of smoke, fire, and a devotion that defies every law of heaven and hell. And as the sun finally rose, casting gold light over the horns of the creature who now ruled my home, I realized I was never going back to a normal life. I was the consort of a prince, the chosen one of a devourer. I reached for another slice of the pizza, which was, miraculously, still warm, and smiled back at him. Let the world try to take this from me. They'd have to get through him first. Waking up the next morning didn't feel real. I kept my eyes closed for a long time, trying to remember if the radiating heat at the foot of my bed was a dream or a death sentence. For years, my eyes had opened to the same gray reality. A drafty window and the weight of knowing I was another 24 hours closer to total ruin. But as I slowly drifted back to consciousness, I realized my sleep hadn't been a choice. It had been heavy and forced, as if the very air in the room had been laced with a sedative. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold. It was the warmth. A deep, thrumming heat that seemed to seep into my bones, tethering me to the mattress. And the smell, the scent of my studio apartment had completely changed. It no longer smelled like damp laundry and failed ambitions. It smelled like expensive, dark-roasted coffee, cedar wood, and the sharp, electric tang of a lightning strike. I opened my eyes, and the memory of the night before hit me like a physical blow. I looked toward the kitchen. He hadn't left. The floor was still cracked. That jagged, blackened fissure in the linoleum was a stark reminder that I hadn't just hallucinated the summoning. The purple wax from the vanilla candles had dried into strange, obsidian-like puddles on the floor, looking like bruised fruit against the cheap tile. It was all real. The pepperoni pizza, the Prince of Hell, and the contract I'd accidentally signed with my own hunger. Malphas was still in his true form, his massive obsidian frame hunched over my small kitchen table. Even sitting down, he loomed over the room, his horns nearly brushing the light fixture. His tail rested lazily across the floorboards, twitching occasionally like a sleeping serpent. He was holding the stack of papers I'd left on the counter, the ones I'd been avoiding for months. "Rin," he rumbled. He didn't turn around, but his voice vibrated through the mattress and into my chest. "You are awake. Your heart has shifted from the slow crawl of a dream to the frantic beat of a human who is realizing their debt has followed them into the daylight." I sat up, clutching the silk duvet he'd conjured the night before. I didn't think you'd still be here. I don't know what I thought. The contract is binding, Rin, he said, finally turning his head. Those burning pits of hellfire met mine, and I felt that same electric jolt of terror. When you call something from the void, you give it more than just your attention. You give it your identity. You summoned a master to sustain you, and I have only just begun to fulfill my end of the bargain. He stood up, the floor groaning under his weight. He walked over to the bed, each step a heavy thud that made the glass of water on my nightstand ripple. He held out the papers, the unpaid bills, the final notices, and the eviction letter that had been haunting my nightmares. "This is what causes that tremor in your soul?" he asked, his voice dripping with genuine confusion. "These small pieces of wood pulp with numbers inked upon them? You treat them as if they are shackles." "They are shackles," I told him, my voice shaking. "Without those numbers, I don't have a place to live, I don't have food, I don't have anything. It's how my world works, Malphas. Everything has a price." Malphas let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "Humans are so incredibly boring. You build a world of infinite beauty, and then you cage yourselves inside a prison of arithmetic. You worry about being cast out of this box because you lack paper? It's not a choice," I snapped, the frustration of years of poverty boiling over. "I've worked 3 jobs. I've skipped meals. I've done everything right, and I'm still losing. That's why I was reading that book. I was desperate." Malphas went silent. He looked at the eviction notice, then back at me. A strange, dark intensity flickered in his eyes. "The contract is binding, Rin. You asked for a master. You asked for one who provides. And a prince of the 7th circle does not allow his chosen to be harassed by such petty debts. If I am to be your provider, I will not have my claim insulted by these scraps." He didn't use a match. He simply blew a breath of gray smoke onto the stack of bills. Instantly, the paper caught fire, but the flames weren't orange. They were a brilliant, shimmering gold. I gasped, moving to jump out of bed, but the heat stayed localized, a concentrated burst of infernal energy. When the flames cleared, the paper was gone. In its place, sitting in his massive palm, was a heavy, solid bar of pure gold. It was the size of a brick, and it glowed with a soft, unnatural luster that seemed to drink in the morning light. He tossed it onto my bedside table. The wood of the table actually groaned, the legs buckling slightly under the weight of a life's worth of labor compressed into a single, cold brick. "Problem solved," Malphas said, looking unimpressed. "The debt is incinerated. The gold is yours. Use it to pay off your petty masters, or melt it down to make a crown. I do not care. But fix this squalor, Rin. It smells like stagnant air and failure in here. It is offensive to my senses." I stared at the gold bar. It was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. It was freedom, wrapped in something terrifying. "I can't just pay rent with a gold bar, Malphas. People will ask questions, the police, the government. Then change the people," he snapped, "or change the room." I hadn't given him permission. I hadn't even finished processing the gold. But Malphas didn't wait for permission. He simply took space as if he had always owned it. He stepped back into the center of the kitchen, his tail lashing with sudden impatience. "If I am to remain here, I will not do so in a box made of rot. You look like a scavenger, and it reflects poorly on my station." "I'm doing my best," I yelled back, though my voice felt thin in the presence of his power. "Your best is over," he said. "Now look at me. This form, it is too much for your fragile mind to process in the daylight, isn't it?" I didn't have time to answer. Red smoke began to swirl around him again, thicker and more suffocating than the night before. I shielded my eyes as the light intensified, feeling a wave of pressure hit my chest. It felt like the air was being squeezed out of the room. I watched through my fingers as his obsidian horns shrank, pulling back into his skull. His lava-etched skin faded, the glowing orange veins dimming until they were replaced by a perfect deep tan. His massive frame shifted, compressing and refining itself into something beautiful. When the smoke cleared, the monster was gone. In his place stood a man. He was still 7 feet tall, with shoulders so broad he seemed to swallow the light. He was wearing a tailored black suit that looked like it was woven from shadows and silk. His eyes were no longer pits of fire, but a deep, burning amber that felt even more intrusive. I felt a sharp, stinging unease. A monster you can see is terrifying, but a monster that looks like this? It was an escalation I wasn't prepared for. He was more dangerous now, hidden behind a mask of perfection that would allow him to follow me anywhere. He looked like he belonged in a skyscraper, not a studio apartment with a leaky faucet. Better? He smirked, his voice now a smooth, rich baritone. Now stand back. He waved a hand through the air, and my apartment began to scream. It was the sound of wood stretching and metal twisting. I watched in a daze as my rusty, creaky bed transformed into a massive California king with silk sheets the color of midnight. The peeling wallpaper smoothed out into charcoal gray Venetian plaster. The kitchen followed. Stained formica became heavy white marble. My empty fridge was suddenly a high-end stainless steel beast, humming with the quiet power of a luxury machine. There, Malphas purred. Now you look like a consort Rin, not a street rat. He walked over to me, and the height difference was even more intimidating now that he looked human. He tilted my chin up with one finger, his nail still slightly too sharp. You look like you're waiting for the floor to drop out from under you again, he noted. Because it usually does, I whispered. Not while I'm here, he said. Get used to the weight of luxury, Rin. I do not do things in small measures. But before I could even process the transformation, a violent banging erupted at the door. My heart dropped. I knew that rhythm. It was Brad, my toxic, soul-draining ex-boyfriend who had spent 2 years taking everything I had before leaving me for greener pastures. Brad didn't wait. He used his old key, or he kicked the lock just right, and stumbled in, smelling of cheap beer and stale regret. He started shouting before he even looked up. I know you got your paycheck. Lend me $50 or I'm taking the... Brad stopped dead. He looked at the marble. He looked at the mahogany. His eyes landed on the gold bar on the nightstand. And then finally, his eyes landed on Malphas. Malphas was leaning against the marble counter, sipping wine from a glass that hadn't been there a second ago. He looked at Brad like he was a particularly dull species of insect. Who's the suit? Brad sneered, his eyes darting to the gold. Is this your new sugar daddy, Rin? You finally found someone to pay for your pathetic little life? I stepped forward, my face burning. Brad, get out. You can't be here. I'll leave when I get what I'm owed, Brad yelled, taking a step toward the gold bar. Where the hell did you get that? He tried to push past me, but Malphas moved. It wasn't a human movement. 1 second he was by the counter, the next he was standing directly in front of Brad, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed my ex whole. The temperature in the room spiked instantly, the air growing heavy with the scent of ozone. I am Rin's provider, Malphas said, his voice dropping into that terrifying gravelly rumble. And who are you? The mistake? Brad turned a splotchy red. He tried to puff out his chest, looking like a toddler next to a titan. I'm his boyfriend. Who the hell are you? You think you can just buy him? Malphas laughed. It was a cold, dark sound that made the windows vibrate. He walked over and stood behind me, wrapping his massive arms around my waist. He pulled me back against his chest, and I felt the solid, dangerous weight of him. I felt a flicker of doubt, a sudden, sharp realization of how absolute his control was. He wasn't just protecting me. He was claiming me. I don't buy him, Malphas purred into my ear. I spoil him. I turn his debt into gold. I fill his stomach. I protect what is mine. He looked at Brad, and for a split second, his eyes flashed a brilliant, glowing red. You drained him. I sustain him. We are not the same. You are a parasite. I am the host. Malphas pointed a single finger at the door. Leave, Malphas commanded. The word was a physical blow that sent Brad stumbling back. Before I decide to feed your soul to my hounds. They've been baying in the shadows of this room since the moment I arrived, and they are very, very hungry. Brad didn't wait. He scrambled out into the hallway in terror, nearly tripping over his own feet. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that felt like a tomb closing. The silence that followed was heavy. Malphas didn't let go of me. He kept his arms wrapped around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. I could feel his heart beating, slow, powerful, and not entirely human. "Your taste in men is offensive," he tutted, shaking his head. "I am taking over your dating life immediately." "You can't do that," I whispered, though I didn't try to pull away. The luxury of the room felt heavy now, like a beautiful cage. "I can do whatever I wish," he said. He picked me up effortlessly and carried me toward the new bed. He laid me down on the silk, his amber eyes searching mine. "You have spent so long fighting for the bare minimum, Rin. You have spent your life hoping for crumbs. Relax. You just look pretty and let me handle the world. Let me be the one they fear so you never have to be afraid again." I looked up at him, at the demon who had turned my poverty into gold and my fear into something that felt dangerously like desire. I knew I should be worried. I knew the contract was binding and the cost was yet to be paid. Safety felt conditional, a gift from a creature that could just as easily tear the world apart. But as he tucked the silk duvet around me, his eyes never leaving mine, I realized I was too tired to be a scavenger anymore. I was tired of being hungry. "I think I could get used to this," I whispered. Malphas smirked, showing those sharp white teeth. "Good, because I am only just getting started. We have a world to collect, Rin." I closed my eyes, falling into a deep, heavy sleep, protected by a monster who treated me like a king. I was starting to realize that kings were just prisoners with better views. I had a demon provider now, and honestly, I was never going back to the world of men. Waking up in a magically conjured luxury bed was one thing. Trying to leave it was an entirely different struggle. The silk sheets felt like liquid against my skin, cooler and more expensive than anything I had ever touched. The mattress was so soft it felt as if it were trying to anchor me there forever, a stark contrast to the lumpy, spring-filled nightmare I had survived on for years. For a long time, I just lay there, staring at the charcoal gray Venetian plaster. The morning sun filtered through heavy velvet curtains, casting a soft amber glow over the room. Everything was too quiet. There was no sound of the radiator clanking, no dripping faucet, and no shouting from the neighbors. There was only the sound of my own breath and the low, heavy thrum of power vibrating through the floorboards. I glanced toward the kitchen area. The floor was still cracked. That jagged, blackened scar in the linoleum served as a constant reminder that the summoning hadn't been a dream. I shifted, and immediately, I felt that familiar heat radiating from the room beyond. Malphas hadn't left. He was everywhere, woven into the very air I breathed. I sat up, my head spinning slightly. The gold bar was still sitting on the mahogany nightstand, a solid, heavy reminder of the bargain I'd struck. I reached out to touch it, the metal cold and unyielding. It was more wealth than my entire family had seen in generations, and right now, it was just a paperweight. I forced myself to get out of bed. I had to go to work. It was a reflex, a deeply ingrained survival instinct that even a prince of hell hadn't been able to burn out of me yet. I needed the consistency of my miserable 9-to-5 existence, if only to prove to myself that I was still Rin, still the person who existed before the pizza and the grimoire. I walked toward the kitchen, but I stopped when I saw him. Malphas was standing by the window. He wasn't wearing the tailored suit from the night before. Instead, he was wrapped in a silk robe the color of a bruised plum. It was open at the chest, revealing bronze skin that looked as if it had been carved out of marble. He looked less like a demon and more like a decadent god, his midnight black hair messy and dark. He turned to look at me, his amber eyes tracking the movement of my legs as I walked. "Where do you think you are going, Rin?" "I'm going to work," I said, trying to sound firm. "I have a shift starting soon." Malphas tilted his head, his expression shifting from amusement to genuine offense. "Work? I turned your debt into a solid brick of gold. I remodeled this hovel into a palace. Why would you return to a place that makes you miserable for, what is the term? Minimum wage?" "Because I need a normal life, Malphas," I yelled, my voice cracking. "I can't just live off demon magic. I need to know I can still survive on my own." Malphas stepped toward me. He didn't walk, he glided. The air around him grew warm, smelling of cedar and spiced chocolate. He stopped just inches away, his height forcing me to tilt my head back until my neck ached. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of my neck. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, his touch possessive and heavy. "You are bound to me, Rin," he whispered, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "You summoned me to sustain you and your hunger." It was so sharp, so pure, it resonated through the circles of the pit in a way I have not felt in eons. I did not answer your call to let you spend your energy answering phones for people who do not deserve to hear your voice. I tried to pull away. I actually braced my hands against his chest to push him back, but it was like trying to move a mountain. I stood my ground for a second, a silent rebellion against the weight of his presence, before his heat overwhelmed my resolve. "I'm an employee at a call center, Malphas. I'm just a person." He let out a sharp, smoky sigh, his eyes flashing a momentary red. "Fine, go. Experience your normalcy for a few hours. But if anyone looks at you the wrong way, if anyone dares to raise their voice to you today, I am melting that building to its foundations. Do you understand?" "Please don't melt my office," I muttered. My skin felt like it was humming where he had touched me. Getting ready for work felt like a comedy of errors. My old clothes looked like rags inside the new mahogany wardrobe. Every time I put on a faded t-shirt, I felt his judgmental gaze on the back of my neck. I eventually settled on a button-down I saved for funerals. But even that felt pathetic compared to the luxury of the room. The commute was even worse. I took the bus, sitting on the cracked plastic seat and staring at the floor. I felt like an imposter. I had a gold bar in my apartment and a demon in my kitchen, but I was still sitting among people who were just as tired and broken as I had been 48 hours ago. Why me? When I walked into the office, the smell of burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner hit me like a slap in the face. It was suffocating. My manager, Mr. Henderson, was already pacing the floor. Henderson was the kind of man who thrived on the small amounts of power he had over people who couldn't afford to quit. "Rin, you're late!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the cubicle walls. "I don't care about your excuses. Finish those regional reports by noon or you're fired. Do you hear me? Fired." I sat down at my dusty desk, my hands shaking. Normally, I would have apologized. I would have put on my headset and started the endless cycle of being yelled at by strangers. But today, his voice sounded different. It sounded small. It sounded like a mosquito buzzing in the ear of a lion. Less than an hour into my shift, the office went quiet. It wasn't a sudden silence. It was a slow, creeping wave of stillness that started at the windows and moved inward. One by one, my coworkers stood up, staring out at the street below. "Is that a Rolls Royce?" someone whispered. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I didn't need to look. I knew. A driver in a black suit opened the rear door. Malphas stepped out onto the cracked pavement. He wasn't in a robe anymore. He was wearing a three-piece charcoal suit that looked like it had been molded to his body. He wore dark sunglasses, his presence so commanding that the traffic on the street seemed to stop just to watch him breathe. He didn't look like a demon. He looked like a billionaire god. Inside the office, chaos erupted. Mr. Henderson was frantically straightening his tie, his face turning a pale, sickly gray. "Oh my God, that must be the new owner from corporate. Everyone, look busy. Rin, hide that coffee stain." The elevator doors at the end of the hall opened with a soft, melodic chime. Malphas walked out. The air in the office changed instantly. The temperature dropped, and the scent of expensive leather and smoke cut through the smell of burnt coffee. Malphas didn't look at the rows of cubicles. He walked with a singular, terrifying focus. Mr. Henderson rushed forward, his best fake smile plastered onto his face. "Sir, welcome. We are so honored." Malphas didn't even slow down. He walked right past him as if he were a potted plant, his eyes locked on mine. He stopped at my dusty, cramped cubicle and took off his sunglasses. "Rin," he said. His voice carried to every corner of the room, heavy with authority. "I lasted less than an hour in that apartment without you. It was unacceptable." The entire office was staring. I felt pinned to my chair. "Malphas, what are you doing here?" "Sir?" Mr. Henderson stammered, scurrying over. "Do you know this employee? Rin has been having some performance issues lately." Malphas turned slowly. It was the movement of a predator acknowledging a gnat. He looked Henderson up and down with a sneer of pure disgust. "Know him?" Malphas asked, his voice dropping to a low growl. "He is mine, and in my world, that makes him your god." The sound of 30 people simultaneously gasping was the only noise in the room. Henderson looked as if he were about to have a heart attack. "You're... what?" "Sir, I'm the branch manager." "You are nothing," Malphas said. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. He slammed it onto Henderson's chest. "I assumed control of the majority shares of this firm this morning," Malphas said, stepping closer to Henderson until the manager was backed against a filing cabinet. "Human markets are only rituals written in numbers. Hell has been trading in them for centuries. Possession is just a contract, and contracts answer to me. I didn't like the idea of Rin answering to another man, especially one who smells of cowardice." Malphas leaned down, his voice dropping so low it was only meant for Henderson. "And me." "I heard you screaming at him when I was in the lobby. You spoke to my consort as if he were a servant." Malphas smiled, but it was just a baring of teeth. "I am restructuring this management. Get your things and leave before I decide to see if your soul tastes as bad as you look." Henderson didn't even argue. He grabbed his briefcase and ran for the elevator. Malphas turned back to me, the terrifying aura vanishing, replaced by that heavy, possessive warmth. He extended a hand toward me, an invitation that felt more like a command. "Grab your bag, darling," he purred. "We are going to lunch. Somewhere that doesn't smell like failed dreams." I looked around at my coworkers. They were looking at me as if I were a ghost. I looked at the dusty computer screen, the headset, the reports. I almost said no. I almost told him he couldn't just buy my life. But then I looked at his hand, steady, powerful, and offering a way out. I grabbed my bag and stood up. "I quit," I whispered. I took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid, and he led me through the office like I was the most precious thing he had ever found. As we stepped into the elevator, Malphas pulled me closer, pressing me against the mirrored wall. His body was a wall of heat. "You are a very expensive habit, Rin," he whispered, his lips brushing my ear. "You're the one who bought the company," I reminded him, my heart racing. "I didn't buy a company," he said, his hand sliding down to grip my waist. "I bought your peace. From now on, you answer only to me. Is that understood?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I felt was a soaring, dangerous sense of freedom. The car was silent, the interior smelling of new leather. We drove through the city, the world outside blurring into gray streaks. Malphas didn't let go of my hand. He held it in his lap, his thumb tracing circles over my knuckles. We went to a private club at the top of a skyscraper. There were no menus, only a host who bowed as if Malphas were a king. We were led to a table on a balcony overlooking the city. As we sat down, Malphas watched me. He didn't look at the view. He looked at me. "You look different today, Rin," he said, his voice soft. "The light is back in your eyes." "I'm scared, Malphas," I admitted. "This is all so fast. What happens when the novelty wears off? When you realize I'm just... me?" Malphas leaned across the table, catching my hand. His grip was unyielding. "You think you are just anything? Rin, you are the one who binds me to this realm. The contract is eternal." He stood up, not waiting for food. He walked around the table and pulled me to my feet, leading me to the edge of the balcony. The city lights twinkled below us like a sea of fallen stars. "Everything you see," he whispered, standing behind me. He wrapped his arms around my chest, pulling me back against him. "It is all beneath you now. You chose me, and in return, I give you the world." He turned me around in his arms, his face inches from mine. His eyes were burning now, the orange glow reflecting in the glass. "The world is the appetizer," he whispered, his hand sliding into my hair, tilting my head back. "I am still waiting for the dessert." He kissed me then. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the taste of smoke, wine, and ancient power. It felt as if the ground were falling away. I clutched at his suit, trying to stay grounded. He groaned into my mouth, a sound of primal hunger that made my knees buckle. When he finally pulled away, his breath was ragged. He looked at me with an expression of such intense devotion that I had to look away. "We are going home," he commanded. The ride back was a blur. I only remember the heat of his hand on the small of my back, guiding me, claiming me. When we walked back into the apartment, it didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a lair. Malphas locked the door with a flick of his wrist. He didn't turn on the lights. The only illumination came from the glowing cracks in the floor and the amber light of his eyes. He walked toward me, shedding his suit jacket. "Rin," he said, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "You asked for a master. Are you ready to see what that truly means?" I looked at the demon who had saved me from starvation and turned my poverty into gold. For a fleeting second, I thought of my old life. The quiet, hungry struggle. The freedom of being a nobody that no one wanted anything from. I could still say no. I could walk out that door and find a way back to the gray. But I looked at him, and I knew I couldn't. I didn't want the old Rin anymore. I didn't want the normal life. "Yes," I whispered. He didn't hesitate. He picked me up and carried me toward the darkness of the bedroom. I summoned a demon for a pepperoni pizza. But as I felt his heat overwhelm me, I realized that I had finally found the one thing I had been hungry for my entire life. I wasn't sure what being full would cost, and I wasn't sure I wanted to survive the answer. Waking up the morning after the dessert was unlike any other morning in my life. There was no sudden jolt of panic, no desperate calculation of how many minutes I could sleep before I had to drag myself to a bus stop. There was only the sensation of weight, warm, solid, and absolute. I was tucked into the curve of Malphas's body, my back against his chest, his arm draped over my waist with the possessive heaviness of a mountain. The room was bathed in a soft, ethereal light. The amber glow didn't come from the sun. It came from the cracks in the floor and from Malphas himself. I looked down at my arm, resting against the charcoal silk of the duvet, and I saw them. Faint, glowing tracings of light beneath my skin. They looked like the veins of lava Malphas had in his true form. They weren't painful. They felt right. They felt like a hum of electricity that had finally found its circuit. The contract wasn't just a piece of paper or a spoken word anymore. It was etched into my very marrow. I was no longer just Rin. I was his. I shifted slightly, and I felt him wake. It wasn't a slow process for him. He simply went from stillness to awareness in a single heartbeat. His grip on my waist tightened, pulling me back until there wasn't a single inch of air between us. He pressed his face into the crook of my neck, his breath hot and smelling of spiced cedar. "Rin," he rumbled. The sound didn't just hit my ears. It resonated in my chest, vibrating through the marks beneath my skin. "The hunger in your soul is quiet today. It is a pleasant change." "I feel strange," I whispered, turning in his arms to face him. In the dim light, his amber eyes were two pools of liquid gold. He looked at me with an intensity that would have terrified me 3 days ago, but now it felt like a shield. I reached up, my fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He leaned into my touch, a predator choosing to be tamed. "You feel complete," Malphas said. "The void you carried for so long, the one that called to me through the dark. It is finally occupied. You are no longer an empty vessel." I looked at the marks on my wrist. "What are these?" "They are my seal," he whispered, lifting my hand to his lips. He kissed the glowing lines, and a wave of heat flooded my body. "They tell every creature in this world and the next that you are under the protection of the seventh circle. They mean that you will never be hungry again. Not for food, not for safety, and never for devotion." I sat up, the silk sliding down my chest. I looked around the room. It was even more beautiful than it had been the day before. The furniture seemed to have settled, the shadows taking on a protective, living quality. "I thought there would be a catch," I said softly. "I've spent my whole life waiting for the other shoe to drop. I thought the price was going to be something terrible, that you'd take me away, or that I'd lose myself." Malphas rose with me, his massive frame dwarfing the bed. He stood and walked toward the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtains. The city below was waking up, people rushing to jobs they hated, struggling for crumbs just like I used to. "The price is your solitude, Rin," Malphas said, his back to me. "I am a prince of the pit. I have existed since before your world had a name. I have had power, wealth, and fear beyond measure. But I have never had a feast for the soul." He turned back to look at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something human in his eyes, something vulnerable. "Your hunger was so pure it acted as a beacon. Most mortals want things. They want fame, or revenge, or trivial riches. But you just wanted to be sustained. You wanted to be full. I didn't take your soul to torture it, Rin. I took it so I wouldn't have to be alone in eternity. That is the cost. You are bound to a monster who will never let you go." I stood up and walked across the room, my bare feet silent on the thick carpet. I stopped in front of him and looked up. "That doesn't sound like a cost to me. That sounds like a gift." Malphas smirked, that wicked, sharp-toothed grin returning. "Then let us show the world how well I can give." The transformation that followed was the final upgrade. He didn't just give me clothes, he gave me an aura. We spent the morning in a blur of luxury that made the previous week look like a rehearsal. A knock at the door brought tailors and stylists, people who worked for the kinds of clients who didn't exist on public records. They didn't ask questions about the 7-foot-tall man in the suit or the glowing cracks in my floor. They just worked in a terrified, reverent silence. By noon, I didn't recognize the person in the mirror. I was wearing a suit of midnight blue velvet that seemed to shimmer as I moved. Around my neck was a heavy platinum chain with a single black diamond that pulsed with a faint internal heat. I looked like a prince. I looked like his. "We are going out," Malphas commanded, offering me his arm. Stepping out of the apartment building felt like a victory lap. The Rolls-Royce was waiting, the driver bowing low as we approached. As we drove through the city, I realized that I wasn't looking at the streets with envy anymore. I was looking at them with a strange, detached pity. I started this as a joke, a desperate, starving mistake at 3 a.m. But as I closed my eyes and let his darkness wrap around me, I knew I had made the best choice of my life. I tried to summon a pepperoni pizza, and instead, I found forever. And that is the story of how a 3 a.m. craving for a pepperoni pizza led to the greatest contract in the history of the Seventh Circle. It turns out, the most powerful summons isn't written in perfect Latin. It's written in the raw, honest hunger for a life worth living. Malphas learned that the world of mortals is more than just debt and numbers, and I learned that sometimes being claimed by a monster is the only way to finally feel free. Our hunger might have started with a pizza, but it ended with a feast that will last for eternity. Thank you so much for listening to the complete story of the Pizza Demon. I hope you enjoyed Rin and Malphas's journey from a tiny, crumbling studio apartment to the heights of the city. If you loved seeing Rin finally get the dessert he deserved, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the shadows grow here at Aether Audio more than you know. And I want to know, if you could summon any prince of hell to help you with your daily life, what would you ask for? A master chef? Someone to fix your Wi-Fi with a snap of their fingers? Or maybe just a 7-foot-tall provider of your own? Let me know in the comments below. I'm Aether. Remember, you are worthy of being more than just full. You are worthy of being cherished exactly as you are. See you in the next story. Bye.